My name is Alex, and I moved into this quiet little suburban town about 6 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start. A charming, tree-lined street. Friendly waves from folks walking their dogs. The kind of place where kids still ride bikes, unsupervised until dusk. My little house. A fixer-upper I'd poured my savings into, felt like a haven after the concrete jungle I'd escaped. For the first few weeks, it was perfect. The air was cleaner. The nights were silent save for the crickets, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Then I noticed him. He lived in the house directly across the street. A 2-story, almost aggressively ordinary looking house with muted gray siding and a perpetually manicured lawn. His name, according to the faded mailbox, was Mr. Silas Blackwood. He was an older gentleman, maybe late 60s or early 70s, with thinning white hair, meticulously combed, and a preference for tweed jackets, even on warmer days. He seemed harmless enough, a fixture of the quiet street. Occasionally seen tending his rose bushes or collecting his mail with a slow, deliberate pace. But there was one thing about Mr. Blackwood that wasn't ordinary. One thing that, over time, began to chip away at the veneer of normalcy in this idyllic little town and settle a cold, heavy stone of unease in my gut. Every single day, without fail, Mr. Silas Blackwood would shut his windows. Not just close them, but firmly latch them. And not just when it was raining, or cold, or windy. No, he did it every single day, regardless of the weather, regardless of the temperature, regardless of anything outwardly apparent. He did it specifically, religiously, before the sun went down. The first time I noticed it, I didn't think much of it. It was a beautiful summer evening, the kind where the air is warm and soft and carries the scent of freshly cut grass. I was sitting on my porch swing, a glass of iced tea in hand, watching the long shadows stretch across the street. I saw Mr. Blackwood out in his front yard, admiring his roses. The sun was still a good hour or so from dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Then, he stopped what he was doing, glanced up at the sky as if checking some invisible clock, and with a surprising briskness for a man of his age, he went inside his house. A few moments later, I heard the distinct sounds of windows being closed, one by one. A soft thud, followed by the click of a latch. It started downstairs, moved upstairs, and within perhaps 5 minutes, every single window in his house was shut tight. I remember feeling a faint pang of curiosity. Maybe he had an allergy to evening pollen. Or perhaps he was particularly susceptible to drafts. I shrugged it off. Everyone has their quirks, I reasoned. But then I saw it the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. It became a ritual. As the late afternoon light began to soften, around the same time, each day, Mr. Blackwood would cease whatever he was doing, whether it was gardening, reading on his porch, or simply sitting in his armchair, visible through his living room window. He would stand up, his movements precise and unhurried, and begin his rounds. Downstairs windows first, living room, dining room, kitchen. Thud. Click, click. Then upstairs, bedroom, study, guest room. Thud. Clicked. He never missed one. Every window, front and back, ground floor and upper floor, secured well before the last rays of sunlight vanished. It wasn't just closing the windows, it was the way he did it. There was a deliberate, almost urgent quality to it, despite his outwardly calm demeanor. As if he were performing a critical task on a strict deadline. His eyes, whenever I happened to catch a glimpse of him during this ritual, held a focused intensity that was absent at other times. They weren't wide with panic, but narrowed with a grim determination. I started to pay attention. I couldn't help it. It was such an unusual behavior, so out of place in this otherwise predictable environment. I found myself glancing at his house as the afternoon wore on, anticipating the familiar sequence of sounds. My neighbors, the friendly folks I'd waved to, didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they never mentioned it. It was like this was just another part of the street's fabric, as normal as Mrs. Gable next door watering her petunias, or the Petersons' dog barking at the mailman. But it wasn't normal. Not to me. The more I observed, the more the simple act of closing windows before sunset transformed in my mind from a harmless eccentricity into something significant. It felt less like a preference and more like a necessity. Like he wasn't just keeping something out, but keeping something safe inside. Or perhaps keeping something in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had a valuable collection he didn't want exposed to the cool evening air. Maybe he had a specific medical condition aggravated by the sunset hours. But none of the explanations felt right. They didn't account for the sheer consistency, the almost ritualistic nature of the act. It wasn't triggered by a change in weather. It was triggered by the position of the sun. As the days shortened, and autumn began to paint the trees in fiery colors, the ritual became even more pronounced. The window shutting time crept earlier and earlier, following the sun's retreating schedule. Mr. Blackwood adjusted seamlessly, performing his task with the same unwavering diligence. Now, sometimes in the late afternoon, while the sun was still quite high in the sky, I found myself structuring my own evenings around his habit. I'd be making dinner or reading a book, and I'd glance out the window waiting for Mr. Blackwood to start his rounds. And once I heard the last thud and click, a strange feeling would descend. It wasn't fear, not exactly, not at first. It was more like a profound sense of isolation. His house, so open and seemingly inviting during the day with its pristine windows, reflecting the sunlight, would become a sealed box as dusk approaches. Dark, silent, impenetrable. And the feeling wasn't just about him. It was about the street itself. Once the windows were closed, the friendly, open atmosphere of the daytime seemed to recede with the light, replaced by a stillness that felt heavy and watchful. The shadows deepened, clinging to the corners of houses and under the thick branches of the old oak trees. The sounds of the neighborhood, distant laughter, the hum of traffic, the occasional barking dog seemed to fade, as if muffled by the closing of not just Mr. Blackwood's windows, but the collective justness of the street. One evening, pure nosiness overriding my better judgment, I decided to stay outside longer than usual. I sat on my porch swing, pretending to read, but my eyes were fixed on Mr. Blackwood's house. He completed his window, shutting ritual as usual, the sounds carrying faintly across the street in the twilight quiet. Then, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, and the official sunset, time arrived, something else happened. The lights in Mr. Blackwood's house didn't come on immediately. The house remained dark, a black silhouette against the deepening indigo sky. For a long time, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, there was no sign of life inside. No lights, no movement visible through the now reflective glass of the closed windows. It was as if the act of shutting the windows had plunged the house into a temporary state of suspended animation. Then, one by one, lights began to appear. Not the bright, welcoming glow of living room lamps or kitchen overheads. These were different. Dimmer, softer. They appeared in the upstairs windows first, a faint, almost yellowish light. Then downstairs, they cast long, weak rectangles onto his front lawn, barely illuminating the rose bushes that were so vibrant in the daytime. The quality of the light was what struck me. It wasn't electric light as I knew it. It had a flickering, uneven quality, like gaslight or perhaps candlelight. And it was weak, as if trying not to escape the confines of the house. It felt ancient, out of place. It didn't chase away the shadows. It seemed to coexist with them, creating new, dancing ones within the rooms I could only partially glimpse. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the mild evening air. This wasn't just a quirk. This wasn't just an old man's habit. This was something else, something deliberate, something protective, or perhaps something fearful. What was Mr. Blackwood so afraid of that he had to seal his house away from the sunset every single day? What came out when the sun went down that required such extreme measures? The questions gnawed at me. They followed me inside my own house as darkness fully fell. I found myself checking my own windows, a new, irrational urge to make sure they were locked creeping in. I dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of focusing too much on my neighbor's odd behavior. But the feeling lingered. The stillness outside felt different now. It felt expectant. Over the next few weeks, my initial curiosity morphed into a low, great obsession. I found myself timing his window, shutting ritual, comparing it to the official sunset time. He was always finished before the sun touched the horizon. Sometimes with minutes to spare, sometimes just barely making it, but always before. I started watching his house more closely. After the windows were closed, I'd see those strange, dim lights moving behind the glass, sometimes seemingly lingering in one room for a long time before moving to another. I tried to make out shapes, figures, anything that might explain what he was doing there during the hours of darkness. But the light was too faint, the reflections on the glass too strong. All I could see were distorted blurs and the occasional suggestion of movement that could easily be my imagination. The quiet of the street at night, which I had initially found so peaceful, now felt oppressive. It was a silence that felt enforced, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath, The usual evening sounds seemed muted, distant. Even the crickets, which had been a constant chorus, seemed to quiet down earlier than usual, their chirping fading away as the last of the sunlight disappeared. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake listening. Listening for what? I didn't know. But the silence felt pregnant with something unseen. Something waiting just outside the edges of my awareness. I'd picture Mr. Blackwood's sealed house across the street, bathed in those strange, flickering lights, and a knot of anxiety would tighten in my stomach. What was he doing in there? What was he protecting himself from? The rational part of my brain screamed that this was ridiculous. He was just an old man with a peculiar habit. Maybe he had sensitive eyes, or maybe he was just incredibly set in his ways. But the other part, the part that felt the cold weight of the evening silence and saw the deliberate, almost desperate way he secured his home, whispered something else. It whispered that there was a reason, a dark, unsettling reason. I considered talking to him. Just a casual, "Hey, Mr. Blackwood, beautiful evening. Why do you always close your windows so early?" But the thought made my stomach clench. There was something about his demeanor, particularly during his ritual, that discouraged casual intrusion. His focused gaze, the determined set of his jaw, it wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't inviting either. It was the look of a man with a singular, important task, a task he would not be interrupted from. I also considered asking my other neighbors. Had they noticed? Did they know why he did it? But again, what would I say? "So, have you guys noticed Mr. Blackwood acts like the apocalypse is coming every time the sun sets?" It sounded insane. I didn't want to be the new eccentric on the block, the one who was obsessed with the old man across the street. So I kept watching. I kept observing. And the mystery of Mr. Silas Blackwood and his sunset ritual continued to grow, weaving itself into the fabric of my new life, transforming the quiet peace I had found here into something laced with apprehension and unspoken dread. The sun was still setting, painting the sky with its fleeting beauty, but for me, and I suspected for Mr. Blackwood, sunset was no longer just the end of the day. It was the beginning of something else. Something that required the world outside to be shut away. Something that lived in the dark. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. The questions were getting louder, the unease deeper. I had to know what was behind those closed windows. What secret Mr. Blackwood was keeping sealed away from the encroaching night. And as the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, the thought of finding out began to fill me with a creeping, terrible sense of dread, but also an irresistible pull. What was out there? What arrived with the setting sun? And why was Mr. Blackwood the only one who seemed to know, and the only one preparing for it? This was my new reality. My quiet, peaceful suburban street, overshadowed by the sealed house across the way and the unsettling knowledge that, when the sun went down, something changed. And I was watching, waiting, and wondering if, one day, I would see what Mr. Blackwood was so desperately trying to keep out. Or worse, what he was keeping in. The darkness was coming, and his windows were always shut before it arrived. The quiet obsession I had developed with Mr. Blackwood's ritual wasn't just consuming my evenings anymore, it was leaching into my days. While I was at work, filing reports or answering emails, a corner of my mind would inevitably drift to the setting sun, calculating how much time was left before Mr. Blackwood would begin his familiar circuit. I'd picture his hands on the latches, the grim set of his jaw. I'd wonder what he was thinking about, what he was preparing for. During those minutes before dusk, the days started to feel less like periods of activity and more like prolonged waits for the inevitable transition into the unsettling quiet of the night. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. I'd lie awake, straining my ears, listening to the profound silence that fell over the street after Mr. Blackwood's final window. Click. Sometimes I heard things, faint scraping sounds from across the street, a low, almost inaudible hum, or what sounded like movement from within the sealed house. But the sounds were always elusive, fading the moment I consciously focused on them, leaving me to question if they were real or just figments of my sleep-deprived imagination. I tried talking to my immediate neighbors, the Gables. They were a lovely elderly couple. Mr. Gable, a retired history teacher, Mrs. Gable, an avid gardener. I approached them casually one afternoon while Mrs. Gable was tending her petunias. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Mrs. Gable?" I started, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, it is, Alex, dear," she replied, smiling warmly. "Good for the flowers." "Yeah, the weather's been great," I continued, steering the conversation slowly. "Say, I've been meaning to ask. You know Mr. Blackwood across the street? Seems like a private sort." Mrs. Gable's smile didn't falter, but a subtle shift occurred. A slight stiffening in her posture, a fractional narrowing of her eyes. "Silas. Yes, he keeps to himself mostly. Been here longer than most of us, I think." "Right?" I pressed gently. "I just noticed. He always seems to shut his windows pretty early. Every day, before the sun goes down. It's just a little unusual, isn't it?" Mrs. Gable paused her watering. She looked across the street at Mr. Blackwood's perfectly ordinary house, currently basking in the late afternoon sun, with its windows wide open, curtains fluttering gently in a non-existent breeze. She blinked slowly. "Oh, that," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes, Silas has his routines. He's always been quite particular about his house. Drafts, you know. Keeps the heat in winter. Cool air in summer, I suppose. Saves on the energy bill." It was such a mundane, practical explanation. Too mundane. Too practical. It didn't fit the deliberate, almost ritualistic nature of the act. The timing tied specifically to the sunset. It didn't explain the strange, dim lights, the deep silence after dark. But Mrs. Gable said it with such an air of finality, as if this was the accepted, unquestionable reason that I felt immediately shut down. "Right. Drafts?" I mumbled, feeling foolish. "Makes sense." Mr. Gable, who had emerged from the house with a cup of tea, overheard. "Silas. Odd bird, that one. Always has been. Doesn't hurt anyone, though. just minds his own business. He took a sip of his tea, dismissing the topic entirely. It was clear they either genuinely didn't see it as strange, or they actively chose not to. Was I the only one who noticed? Or the only one who cared? The conversation left me feeling more isolated in my observation than before. The neighborhood wasn't just indifferent. It seemed to have built a collective blind spot around Mr. Blackwood and his sunset ritual. Unable to get answers from the neighbors, I decided I needed to observe more closely. I started spending my evenings after sunset sitting in my living room, lights off, peering through the gaps in my curtains, Mr. Blackwood's house across the street. The house was a dark shape against the night sky. Those faint, yellowish lights appearing in different windows at different times. One night, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain, I decided to get closer, armed with my phone flashlight, which I kept off and wearing dark clothing. I waited until the street was completely quiet. Well, after Mr. Blackwood would have finished his ritual. The air was cool and still. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light. I crept out my front door, moving quietly across my lawn and onto the sidewalk. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long, distorted shadows. Mr. Blackwood's house loomed, darker and more imposing up close. The silence was thicker here, pressing in on me. I crossed the street, staying on the opposite side from his front door, hiding partially behind a large oak tree that offered good cover. From here, I had a slightly better angle on his downstairs windows. The faint yellow light emanated from what I assumed was his living room. I could see the edge of a curtain, but it was thick and opaque, obscuring the interior. I stayed there for a long time, just watching, listening. The only sounds were the distant hum of the town and the blood pounding in my own ears. The air felt colder near his house, a palpable chill that wasn't present on my side of the street. It wasn't just the temperature. It felt like the air itself was thin, drained of warmth and energy. Then I heard something. It was a low, guttural sound. Not a growl, not a moan, but something deep in a chest. It seemed to come from inside the sealed house. It wasn't loud, barely a whisper, but in the absolute stillness of the night, it carried to me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I strained my ears, trying to hear it again, to identify it. Was it Mr. Blackwood? Was he ill? Was he in pain? Or was it something else? The sound was brief, cutting off abruptly, leaving the silence feeling even more profound and terrifying. I waited, tense, for it to return, but it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, a different sound reached me, a faint scrape against wood. It sounded like something being dragged across a floor, slow and heavy. It moved from what I thought was the living room towards the center of the house. My breath hitched in my throat. What was he dragging? And why in the dark? I wanted to run, to sprint back, to the safety of my own house, lock the door, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I was rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination warring with sheer terror. I kept watching the windows, looking for any sign, any movement. anything to explain the sounds. The yellowish light in the living room shifted, dimming slightly, as if the source of the light was moving or being obscured. Then, for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shadow flicker behind the thick curtain. Not a human-shaped shadow. It was elongated, jagged, moving with an unnatural speed across the obscured pane. My imagination, sleep deprivation, or something real. The shadow was gone in an instant, leaving only the faint, steady glow. But the image was seared into my mind. An impossible shape, a fleeting horror glimpsed at the edge of vision. I couldn't stay there any longer. The chill in air felt like it was seeping into my bones, and the silence was now thick with a palpable presence. Something unseen and deeply wrong. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark house, until I reached the relative safety of my own lawn. I practically ran inside, locking the deadbolt with trembling hands. I didn't turn on any lights. I just stood in the dark living room, pressing my back against the door, listening. The street was silent again, seemingly oblivious to the unsettling activity I had just witnessed or imagined it across the road. Mr. Blackwood's house remained a dark, sealed box, those faint, sickly lights the only sign of life within. That night, I didn't just have trouble sleeping. I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak of my old house, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded amplified, threatening. I kept replaying the low sound, the scraping, the fleeting shadow. My rational mind fought back, trying to conjure logical explanations. Mr. Blackwood was sick. He was moving furniture. I was seeing things in the dark. But the feeling, the gut, deep certainty that something wrong was happening, was impossible to shake. The next day, I saw Mr. Blackwood in his yard, tending his roses as if nothing had happened. He looked the same as always, neat, quiet, deliberate. There was no sign of illness, no exhaustion in his posture. Just the same reserved demeanor. He even offered a brief, polite nod as I left for work, his eyes seemingly calm and ordinary. It was jarring. This stark contrast between his daytime appearance and the unsettling reality of his sealed house at night. It was as if he was two different people, or living two different lives, one exposed to the mundane light of day, the other hidden away in the protective darkness behind locked windows. The routine continued, day after day. The sun would begin its descent. Mr. Blackwood would start his rounds, sealing his house away from the encroaching night. And I would watch, feeling that familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I tried searching online. Neighbors with strange habits, people who fear sunset, unexplained sounds at night, suburban. The results were predictably unhelpful. Forums discussing annoying neighbors, articles about sundown syndrome in dementia patients, ghost stories that felt too theatrical compared to the subtle, pervasive dread I was experiencing. There was nothing that resonated with the specific, methodical ritual of shutting windows before sunset, tied to those dim, strange lights and the unsettling sounds within. I started thinking about the history of the street, of the town. Had anything strange ever happened here? Any old legends? Any unexplained events? I couldn't find anything online, but perhaps the local library or historical society might have information. It felt like a long shot, but the need to understand was becoming unbearable. The feeling of being the only one aware of this growing darkness was the worst part. It was like living in a horror movie, where the only character who sees the monster, while everyone else goes about their lives, oblivious, was I going crazy? Was I projecting my own anxieties onto a harmless old man? The doubt was a cruel twist, adding a layer of psychological horror to the external mystery. But the memory of that low sound, the scrape, the shadow, it felt too real to dismiss entirely. It felt like a crack had appeared in the ordinary reality of this street, and I had glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be there. The sun was setting earlier now. The window shutting ritual started earlier, too. The period of sealed, silent darkness in Mr. Blackwood's house was growing longer each day, and with each passing day, my conviction grew. Mr. Blackwood wasn't just protecting himself from drafts. He was protecting himself, or perhaps the world, from something that emerged with the absence of light. Something that didn't like the sun. Something that stirred and moved behind locked windows, illuminated by those strange, weak lights. I knew I couldn't just watch forever. The questions were too loud, the unease too potent. I had to find out what was happening. I had to understand why Mr. Blackwood was so afraid of the dark. And I had a terrible feeling that the only way to get answers was to get closer. Much closer. The darkness was coming. And the sealed house across the street felt like the epicenter of a secret the whole neighborhood was ignoring. I was no longer just an observer. I was being drawn in, step by reluctant step, towards the shadows that gathered around Mr. Blackwood's house each night. What would happen when I finally got close enough to see inside? The thought terrified me. But the alternative, living with this knowing uncertainty, felt even worse. The whispers in the dark were calling to me, and I was starting to listen. The whispers in the dark, the scraping sounds, the impossible shadow, they weren't just memories anymore. They were imprinted on my mind, looping constantly, eroding my sense of reality. The line between what I had possibly imagined and what I was certain I had witnessed blurred, leaving me in a constant state of nervous exhaustion. Sleep offered no refuge. My dreams were filled with locked windows, creeping shadows, and the chilling sound of something being dragged across a floor. My job performance started to slip. I was distracted, jumpy. My colleagues noticed. They'd ask if I was feeling all right, if everything was okay at home. I'd offer vague reassurances, forcing a smile, all the while thinking about the angle of the sun outside and how much time was left before the ritual would begin. The outside world, with its mundane concerns of deadlines and meetings, felt increasingly flimsy and irrelevant compared to the dark mystery unfolding across the street every single night. I couldn't approach Mr. Blackwood directly. My failed attempt to discuss it with the Gables had proven that the topic was either taboo or genuinely invisible to my neighbors. They lived in a state of willful ignorance, or perhaps actual ignorance. Was it possible I was the only one with eyes to see, or ears to hear? The thought was terrifying in its isolation. I decided I needed more information, something that wasn't filtered through my own, potentially unreliable senses in the dead of night. The idea of local history. Research from Part 2 resurfaced. I took a sick day from work, telling my boss I had a terrible migraine, not entirely allied. Instead of staying in bed, I drove to the small town library. It was a quaint, old building, smelling of dust and aged paper. I found the local history section and started digging. I looked through old town records, newspaper archives, local history books. I searched for Mr. Blackwood's name, for the address of his house, for any mention of unusual occurrences on my street, particularly anything related to strange phenomena or unexplained events occurring around sunset or during the night. Most of it was mundane, articles about town council meetings, bake sales, high school football games. There was some history on the older houses, including mine and Mr. Blackwood's. His house, built in the early 1900s, had a simple history, passed down through a couple of families, renovated a few times. No mentions of anything out of the ordinary. Discouraged, I was about to give up when I stumbled upon a small, self-published pamphlet tucked away in the back of the local history section. Its title was faded, something about local folklore and unexplained tales. It seemed less like formal history and more like collected gossip and old wives' tales. Flipping through it, I found a short, untitled entry under the heading, Sunset Peculiarities. The entry was cryptic and vague, written in a somewhat rambling style. It spoke of the old ways, the thinning veil, and how the boundary between here and elsewhere softens when the light dies. It mentioned risen the sun, ancient hungers, and the need for proper warding when the shadows lengthen. It didn't mention specific locations, waits, locations or names, but the timing when the light dies and when the shadows lengthen resonated chillingly with Mr. Blackwood's ritual. It was written in the language of folklore, not fact, but it sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Could this be what he was preparing for? Some unseen force that emerged at dusk. The pamphlet was frustratingly unspecific. It felt like it was hinting at something vast and terrible without ever naming it. It reinforced the idea of a danger at sunset, but offered no concrete details about what that danger was. Still, it was the first thing I had found that acknowledged the specific timing of the threat. It suggested that this wasn't just Mr. Blackwood's personal delusion. There might be a basis for it in local, albeit obscure, belief. Leaving the library, the sunlight felt less comforting than it had before. It felt temporary, a fragile barrier against whatever was described in that pamphlet. My investigation hit a wall of dead ends. I couldn't find anything else concrete. The only path left was more direct observation. That night, I prepared more carefully. I retrieved an old pair of binoculars from the back of a closet. I waited until the neighborhood was completely dark and silent, the streetlights providing the only illumination. Mr. Blackwood's house was sealed, those dim, yellowish lights glowing faintly in the windows. This time, I didn't stay by the oak tree. I decided to try and get a closer look from the side of his house, where there was a narrow alleyway between his fence and the next property. It was riskier, closer to his windows, but might offer a better angle. Creeping across the street and down the alley, the silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. The air in the alley was even colder than out front, with a strange, stagnant quality to it. It felt heavy, dead. I reached a point where I could see one of his downstairs windows relatively clearly through a gap in the fence and some overgrown bushes. The thick curtain was drawn, but I could see the faint light bleeding around the edges. Carefully, slowly, I raised the binoculars to my eyes, focusing on the gap where the light was strongest. Through the powerful lenses, the view was magnified, sharper. I could see the weave of the thick, dark fabric of the curtain. And then, just through the tiny gap, where it didn't quite meet the window frame, I saw a sliver of the room inside. It was difficult to make out details in the dim, flickering light, but I could see a section of a wall, covered in what looked like aged wallpaper with a dark, swirling pattern, and then I saw movement. Not Mr. Blackwood. The movement was low to the ground, slithering or dragging itself just above the floorboards. It was dark, darker than the shadows it moved within. It wasn't a distinct shape, more like a shifting mass of concentrated darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, accompanied by that faint scrape, sound I had heard before. It moved into the sliver of my vision, paused for a moment, and then moved out. It was formless, unnatural. It didn't have limbs or a head, or any discernible features of an animal or person. It was just wrong. A moving patch of absolute blackness in the dim light. My hands trembled, the binoculars shaking slightly. What was that? Was it some kind of large rodent? A weird shadow effect. My rational mind was scrabbling for explanations, but the image of that dark, formless thing dragging itself across the floor was already seared into my memory, overriding logic. I kept watching the gap, my breath held tight in my chest. The dark mass didn't reappear in that specific spot, but I could see the light shifting slightly in the room, suggesting the source of the light, perhaps a lantern or candle, was being moved, following the movement of the dark shape. The scraping sound continued intermittently, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, indicating the thing was moving around the room. There were other sounds now toothed, wet slithering noises, and occasionally that low, guttural sound again, like a pained sigh or a whisper of raw hunger. It wasn't just happening in one room. As I watched the light and listened, I could hear the sounds moving, sometimes seeming to shift to a different part of the house entirely, though still on the ground floor. It was as if this thing was patrolling the perimeter of the house, moving from room to room, just inside the barrier of the sealed windows. And then I heard Mr. Blackwood. His voice was low, strained, barely audible. He wasn't speaking words, not that I could make out. It was more like a constant murmur, a repetitive chant or prayer. It was steady, unwavering, a counterpoint to the unsettling sounds of the moving darkness. He was accompanying it, perhaps, or trying to ward it away with his quiet incantation. He wasn't interacting with it, in a way that suggested communication. His voice sounded wary, resigned, but determined, like someone performing a necessary, albeit horrifying duty. The air around me, in the alley, seemed to grow colder still, the heavy stillness pressing in. It felt like the boundaries described in the pamphlet were thinning right here, right now. I had the terrifying sense that I was too close, that I was trespassing on something ancient and dangerous. Then, without warning, the dim light in the room I was watching suddenly flared, just for a second, casting a brief, sickly yellow glow through the gap in the curtain. In that split second, the dark mass was illuminated more clearly. It was definitely not an animal. It was larger, denser, and its edges seemed to writhe and shift as if made of liquid shadow. And for that fraction of a second, I saw something else within the mass, brief, glinting points of light, like tiny wet eyes reflecting the flare. My gasp was loud in the silent alley. The light snapped back to its previous dimness instantly. The scraping and slithering sounds paused. The air went utterly still. It was as if everything in the house had frozen, listening. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Had they heard me? Had it heard me? I stayed frozen, binoculars still pressed to my eyes, staring at the dark house. The silence, stretched tense and absolute. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. Every instinct screamed at me to run. After what felt like an eternity, the scraping sound resumed, but it was different this time. It was closer to the window, slower, more deliberate. It was moving towards the gap where I was watching. Panic seized me. I didn't hesitate this time. I lowered the binoculars, turned, and stumbled back down the alley as quietly as I could, my eyes fixed on the dark shape of the house. I expected to see a light flick on, to hear a door open, to feel something unseen grabbing at me from the shadows. But nothing happened. I reached the street, crossed it half running, and fumbled with my keys at my own front door. Inside, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My legs were shaking uncontrollably. I hadn't just heard things tonight. I had seen something. Something that defied explanation. Something that belonged in the realm of nightmares. The pamphlet's cryptic warnings suddenly felt terrifyingly real. Things that resent the sun. Yes. That formless darkness that moved in the dark, lit by ancient light, accompanied by sounds of dragging and slithering and guttural whispers. And Mr. Blackwood, chanting, murmuring, keeping vigil. Or is he its captor? Or its guardian? Or just another prisoner, forced to share his home with this entity? Once the sun went down, the questions were still there, but now they were overlaid with a thick layer of sheer horror. I had confirmation. Something was happening across the street. Something was in Mr. Blackwood's house after dark. And it was something that made a grown man meticulously seal every window and spend his nights chanting against the darkness. I looked out my own window at Mr. Blackwood's house, It was still dark, still sealed. The dim lights were still there, faint and unsettling. The silence of the street felt less peaceful than ever before. A thin veneer over a terrifying reality I had just glimpsed. I was no longer just curious. I was terrified. But the terror was mixed with a desperate need to understand, to know what I was dealing with, what my neighbor was dealing with. I had come too close to turn back now. But I also knew, with a chilling certainty, that getting closer was becoming exponentially more dangerous. The darkness had a shape now, however, ill-defined, and it was just across the street, waiting for the sun to set. And perhaps now, it knew I was watching. The sealed windows weren't just keeping something out. They were keeping something in. And I had just peered through a crack in the seal. What would happen when it decided to look back? Seeing that thing was the breaking point. It shattered the last remnants of my rational denial. This wasn't an old man's eccentricity, a medical condition, or an overactive imagination. There was something genuinely, horrifyingly wrong across the street. The dark, formless mass, the slithering sounds, the ancient flickering light, Mr. Blackwood's wary chanting, it all coalesced into a nightmare reality that I could no longer ignore. The terror I felt was profound and paralyzing. I barely slept for days after. Every shadow in my own house seemed to deepen. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like it came from just outside my door. I found myself checking my own windows. Constantly, an irrational fear that whatever was in Mr. Blackwood's house could somehow get into mine, despite my outward efforts to appear normal. I started closing my windows earlier too, not latching them with the same desperate urgency as Mr. Blackwood. But the instinct was there, a seed of his fear taking root in my own mind. Yet, beneath the terror, the desperate need to understand festered. What was that thing? Why was it there? What was Mr. Blackwood doing? Was he fighting it? Containing it? Appeasing it? The cryptic pamphlet hinted at ancient hungers and things that resent the sun, things that emerged when the thinned. Was his house built on a place where this veil was particularly thin? Was Mr. Blackwood a protector or a jailer? The nights became an agonizing vigil. I no longer dared to go into the alley, but I watched from my darkened living room. The binoculars clutched in my hands. The ritual never changed. As the sun began its descent, Mr. Blackwood would meticulously seal his house. The faint yellow lights would appear. The deep, unnatural silence would fall over the street. And I would watch, knowing that behind that sealed facade, the dark mass was moving, slithering, accompanied by those chilling sounds and the low, constant murmur of Mr. Blackwood's voice. The fear was wearing me down, eroding my sanity. I knew I couldn't live like this. I had to do something. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbor closes his windows before sunset, and I think he has a formless shadow monster in his house. I'd be laughed at, probably institutionalized. I was on my own. My options felt limited and terrifying. I could try talking to Mr. Blackwood again, perhaps at a time of day when the threat seemed dormant. Or I could try to get undeniable proof, something that would force the authorities, or at least someone, to believe me. The latter seemed impossible without putting myself in immense danger. But the thought of living year after year, knowing what was across the street, watching that house seal itself away from the light, feeling the pervasive dread settle over the neighborhood every night, it was a fate worse than almost any alternative. I decided to try Mr. Blackwood one more time. I would wait until midday, when the sun was high and the entity presumably dormant. I would approach him directly, calmly, and ask him about the windows, about the nights. It was a long shot, but I had to try. The next day I waited. The sun was at its zenith, flooding the street with bright, warm light. Mr. Blackwood was out in his front yard, watering his rose bushes, just as he often was during the day. He looked utterly normal, a harmless old man enjoying the sunshine. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I walked across the street. "Mr. Blackwood," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned, his watering can still in his hand. His expression was polite, if a little distant. Alex. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood," I said, trying to sound casual. "Beautiful roses." "Thank you," he replied with a slight smile. "They require diligent care." "I can see that," I said, then paused, searching for the right words. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been meaning to ask you about something. It's about the evenings. Your windows." His smile vanished instantly. His eyes, which had seemed calm moments before, became guarded, wary. "My windows?" "Yes," I pressed on, feeling the carefully constructed calmness beginning to fray. "You always close them before sunset." "Every day. I was just curious. It seems like a very strict routine." He put the watering can down slowly. His posture stiffened, becoming rigid. The air between us seemed to grow colder, despite the midday sun. "It is necessary," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "Necessary?" I asked, taking a small step closer. "Why is it necessary, Mr. Blackwood? What are you keeping out? Or keeping in?" His gaze was sharp now, intense. It held a depth of knowledge and wary resignation that chilled me more than any shadow. "Some things," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "do not belong in the light. They belong in the light, and they crave what the light protects." My blood ran cold. "The things from the pamphlet," I blurted out, instantly regretting showing I had been investigating. "The thinning veil. The ancient hungers." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked by a deep sadness. "You have been looking," he stated, not as a question, but a wary acknowledgement. "You should not have looked." "What is it, Mr. Blackwood?" I pleaded, lowering my voice. "What is in your house?" He looked past me, down the street, then back at his house. A profound sorrow etched on his features. "It has been here for a long time," he said, his voice heavy with history. "Since before this town was built. This land, it holds a scar, a weakness in the world. And when the sun goes down, the scar opens, and something crosses over." He finally looked back at me, his eyes filled with a terrible knowledge. "It feeds on the light, Alex. Not the light of the sun, but the light within things. Life, warmth, consciousness. The sealed windows, the wards, the chanting, they are a barrier. They keep it contained, keep it from spreading, keep it from consuming. Consuming? I whispered, horrified. It grows stronger in the dark. He continued, his voice taking on a low, urgent tone. The light weakens it, forces it back to the edge. But it is always there, always waiting. He picked up his watering can again, a clear dismissal. You have seen too much, Alex. You know too much. Forget it. Live your life. And for your own safety, always shut your windows before the sun goes down. And make sure they are latched. He turned back to his roses. His movements deliberate, final. I stood there, stunned into silence, the bright midday sun suddenly feeling utterly inadequate. I wanted to ask more. How did it get there? Why his house? How long had he been doing this? But his posture, his tone, was a clear boundary. He had said what he needed to say, issued his warning. As I walked slowly back across the street, my mind reeled. It was real. All of it. The formless entity, the darkness, the danger tied to sunset. Mr. Blackwood wasn't crazy. He was a sentinel, a guardian of a terrible secret, performing a vital, terrifying duty every single night. The confirmation brought no relief, only a deeper, colder dread. Knowing what the threat was, even vaguely, made it more real, more terrifying. The next few days were the worst. The knowledge sat heavy in my stomach like lead. The sunset ritual across the street became an unbearable countdown to the emergence of that dark, slithering thing. I shut my own windows now, locking them tightly. But it felt like a pathetic gesture compared to the ancient warding Mr. Blackwood was performing. Then, one evening, as the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows, a critical time, just before Mr. Blackwood would normally be finishing his rounds, I heard a sound that wasn't the familiar thud and click. It was a loud, splintering CK. It came from Mr. K. Blackwood's house. My blood ran cold. I rushed to my living room window, peering out. Mr. Blackwood wasn't at his windows. He was standing on his porch, looking up at his house with a look of sheer, unadulterated horror on his face. Another Shrek! This time, I saw it. One of the upstairs windows. The glass didn't just break. It seemed to flex inwards, warping like plastic under immense pressure, before shattering outwards in a cascade of glass. Then, the sounds started. Not the faint scraping and slithering I had heard before. These were louder, more frantic. A tearing sound like wet fabric ripping. A guttural, echoing roar that was nothing like a human sound. The faint yellow lights inside Mr. Blackwood's house began to flicker wildly. Then one by one, they winked out. Darkness flooded the rooms I could see through the now broken window. Mr. Blackwood stumbled back, his hand flying to his chest. He looked frail, terrified. No longer the determined sentinel, but a man facing an overwhelming horror. More windows began to buckle and break, one after another, the sounds of shattering glass mingling with the hideous noises from within. The dark entity I had glimpsed, or something far worse, was no longer contained. The seal was breaking. I could feel it from across the street. The air grew impossibly cold, a draining, suffocating cold that reached out from the dark house. A heavy, cloying smell, like stagnant water and something rotten, began to drift across the street. And then I saw it. Not through a window this time. It emerged from the jagged, broken opening where the upstairs window had been. A tendril of absolute, consuming darkness. It was thicker than the shadow I had seen before, wreathed with an unnatural energy, and seemed to drink the light from the very air around it. It stretched out tentatively, like a sensing organ, towards the street. Mr. Blackwood let out a choked cry and stumbled back into his house, slamming the door shut behind him. A futile gesture now. My mind went blank with terror. The pamphlet, the ancient hunger, it fed on the light within. The dark tendril retracted back into the broken window for a moment. The horrific sounds inside intensified, followed by a new sound, Mr. Blackwood screaming. A short, choked scream that ended abruptly. Silence. A terrible, absolute silence fell over Mr. Blackwood's house. The sounds from within ceased. The remaining dim lights went out, plunging the house into total darkness. But the cold remained. The foul smell intensified, and the house itself seemed to pulse faintly with a dark, internal energy. Then, slowly, deliberately, the tendril of darkness emerged again from the broken upstairs window. This time, it didn't retract. It hung there for a moment, a living void against the twilight sky, before another tendril and another began to push their way out of the other broken windows. They were reaching out, stretching across the lawn towards the street, towards the other houses, towards my house. I backed away from my window, stumbling over furniture. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The street was still quiet, bathed in the fading light of dusk. Had no one else heard? No one else seen? Were they all inside, living in their ignorant bliss, their windows still open to the encroaching night? I had to get away. I had to leave. But as I fumbled for my keys, my eyes were drawn back to Mr. Blackwood's house. The dark tendrils were lengthening, reaching the edge of his lawn. They seemed to flow like liquid shadow, silent and unstoppable. And then, in the utter darkness of Mr. Blackwood's house, 2 points of faint, sickly yellow light appeared in the upstairs window frame, where the tendril had first emerged. They were low down, close together, like eyes. They seemed to be looking directly at me. I froze, caught in their unseen gaze. The cold intensified, seeping through the walls of my house. The foul smell was stronger now, clinging to the air. Mr. Blackwood's final warning echoed in my mind. It feeds on the light within things. My own lights were on. My windows were shut, but were they latched? Were my seals strong enough? The pamphlet hadn't mentioned mere glass being sufficient. It spoke of warding. The tendrils flowed off Mr. Blackwood's lawn and onto the street, silent and unseen by the few cars that drove past. They moved with a horrifying purpose, dividing and spreading, reaching for the other houses on the street. And the eyes in Mr. Blackwood's dark house remained fixed on me. I knew then that my curiosity had condemned me. I had seen the secret, and now the secret had seen me. Mr. Blackwood's sealed house wasn't just a containment. It was a sacrifice, He was keeping it occupied, keeping it fed, preventing it from looking elsewhere. But now the seal was broken, and it was looking. The last rays of the sun disappeared below the horizon. Total darkness fell. Across the street, Mr. Blackwood's house was a void, save for those two faint, malevolent yellow lights that seemed to bore into my soul. I could hear it now, just outside my walls. A faint scraping, a low, wet slithering. The cold was unbearable. The smell was nauseating. My windows were locked. But I knew, with a bone, deep certainty, that locks wouldn't stop this. Nothing that relied on physical barriers would. The final sound I heard before the fear consumed me entirely was a soft, insistent tap against my living room window. Not the tap of a ranch or rain. It was a deliberate, searching tap, and then another, and another, moving slowly, steadily across the glass. It had found my window. It knew I was inside. The light within me felt like it was flickering, growing weak. The darkness outside pressed in, eager to consume. Mr. Blackwood's house was silent, its duty done, its sacrifice made. The thing he had kept contained was free. And it was at my window, tapping, waiting for the light to finally go out. The sunset had come. My windows were shut. But the darkness had arrived anyway. And I was its next target. The end of the street felt very, very far away. And the tapping was getting louder,